that there's a way we can know something independently of the one who is seeking it, Socrates is establishing the criteria for the truth. Right? The truth is what the soul comes to discover that also conforms to what is in the eternal order of things. The questioning that we do in geometry sets the pattern for the kind of questioning that we can do to discover the truth. We don't know the measure of shapes. We do a kind of questioning by which we discover the shapes, we discover their measure, and then independently of what we think about it, we see that this thing is true. And then the middle of the dialogue then is that the truth about reality is always with us. It's in the soul. Right? And Socrates says at 86b and c, I would contend at all costs, both in word and deed, as far as I could, that we will be better men, braver and less idle, if we believe that one must search for the things one does not know, rather than if we believe that it is not possible to find out what we do not know and what we must not look for, and that we must not look for it. In other words, we have a choice. We can either be skeptics and not look for the true and the good, and therefore what is virtuous. And Socrates says, I'm not willing to do that. Or we can be, with respect to virtue, we can be like we just were with respect to geometry. We can try to question and wonder and advance in our knowledge of what is true and what is good, in a way that we will eventually be able to establish what is true independently of what we think. The point here, I think, is that there is a truth, or there is a truth about things, which is true before we come to learn it. And there's another insinuation, there's another suggestion at 88d that the only way that someone can become free is to discover this truth. That what's at stake in discovering this truth is the capacity to rule one's soul. If we can learn how to rule our souls, we are free. If we fail to rule our souls, our passions will enslave us, and we may think we are free, but we will never be free. Even if we're not sure what the truth is, just as in geometry, we can start by making a hypothesis and trying to advance in our knowledge based on advancing the hypothesis. Eventually, if we do this, our knowledge can become a kind of wisdom. And remember, wisdom, there's a distinction here, I think, between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge is what the intellect comes to know. Wisdom is what the person is the knowledge that the person incorporates into his behavior. Right? Wisdom is knowing the truth, and it's also living it, or loving it and living it. And so ultimately, all things do depend on the soul, because they depend on wisdom. They depend on not just knowing something, but also living the right way. And ultimately, having the right affections for the right things. Being able to laugh and cry at the right moment at the right things. But our affections cannot be divorced from what is true and what is good. I think one feature of modern philosophy since the Enlightenment is that the best moral philosopher is the person with the right affections or emotions. But modern philosophy tends to leave out virtue. It tends to judge the emotions independently of virtue. So if I say something that offends you, I'm a bad person, independently of whether I or you have virtue or vice.
Yeah, you're pretty screwed.
Well, but this is the thing. In our society, oftentimes, the criteria of whether what someone says is right or wrong is not whether it is true or false, or whether they say it in the right way or the wrong way. The sole criteria oftentimes seems to be that it is whether the people who are receiving what was said are offended or not. If someone is offended, then it shouldn't be said. If someone is not offended, then it's okay. Pardon?
Is it just like yourself? Is it the more conservative? Because they're offended about something?
Oh yeah, no, I know. No, but that's the thing. Well, this is the point of the Gorgias.
And it's a good thing to say.
Right, no, but this is the whole point of the Gorgias, right? That the group, if there is no truth, then it's the group that is offended, they can use that as a way of establishing power. They can use the victim complex as a way of establishing power for themselves. So if there is no truth, then in some sense, yeah, whether I'm offended or not, that's a mechanism for me to establish power for myself. If I can't establish power by punishing you physically, I will establish power by saying I'm offended if you say the wrong thing. And so, in some sense, the speech code, this is speech codes. I would rather have the Inquisition than a modern speech code. Why is that? The whole point of the Inquisition was that if people were in error at a university, if they taught something that was false, there was a trial, or in society. Because the truth is the first requirement of the common good. So the whole idea behind the Inquisition was, if someone says something that is erroneous or that is false, they should be willing to go public and defend what they say. And if in a trial where there is, the punishments could be different. The punishment could be something like if what is erroneous. If you're in error and you're refusing, if it's shown to you that you're in error and you refuse to acknowledge it, you might be silenced for a year to think about it. Right? That was the idea. So, for example, Aquinas was put on trial during his life. In 1272, he was put on trial. And in his trial, he proved that he didn't say anything that was false. Right? That he didn't say anything that was against the common good. And so there was no punishment, right? Oftentimes in the trials, the people involved would agree to the punishment before the trial if they were found to be in error in some way. Oftentimes the punishment would just be, well, retract what you said. If you retract what you say, well, that's the punishment. Now, in more extreme political situations, there were more radical punishments. But I think one thing that is better about the Inquisition than modern speech codes is that in modern speech codes, oftentimes, if you say the wrong thing, you get attacked. You can get blackmailed, you can get slandered, and you have no recourse to defend yourself. Right? In other words, if I were being attacked or slandered in the Middle Ages, I could say, I want a trial. I want a public trial where my accusers come forward and defend me, accuse me publicly of the erroneous things I have said. What happens in a modern university oftentimes is that if someone says something that offends the speech code, there's a slander campaign or a whisper campaign, or a committee is started, and the committee has the purpose of somehow trying to throw the person out. And there's never a trial, and the person never has a chance to defend themselves. Maybe it is like Survivor. I don't know. I've never really seen Survivor, so I can't really comment on it.
The other half, though.
Yes. Question? So, we can come to know the truth of things. And even if we don't know the truth, we can start to make hypotheses to test those hypotheses to see if they are true. If we do this, and if we try to live the right way, we will start to grow in wisdom. The next point Socrates tries to make is that virtue is teachable. In other words, we're not born good. And also he alludes to Polycrates. Polycrates in the Persian Wars, in Herodotus in the Persian Wars, we learn that he's a guy that finds a ring in the sea, and the ring enables him to become a dictator and a tyrant in a city. And he's able to do this for most of his life. But then by the end of his life, he is crucified by the Persians for the injustices that he's done. So, in other words, we can't just magically live virtue either. Ultimately, virtue must be teachable. And the reason that Meno gets it wrong is that it's not virtue is not knowledge in the way that Meno thinks it's knowledge. You know, virtue is not just learning how to manipulate the crowd. It's not just learning how to run an advertising campaign. It's not just learning how to win political office or learning how to make a lot of money. Virtue involves habits. And habits are not, this is the problem that Meno can't get. Habits are not, strictly speaking, intellectual. They are things that we actually do every day. If you want to acquire a habit, for example, people who have sleeping disorders, people who stay up too late and they want to learn how to go to bed on time and get up on time, they have to suffer for 6 months at least. In other words, you got to make the resolution to go to bed on time, to not sleep, and to get up the next day and be tired the next day. And then you got to be willing to gut this out for 6 months, and then you can change your sleeping habits. But that's the only way you can do it. You got to change your habits.
6 months.
Where's Drew?
Drew is speaking of the Gorgias, Drew is at a student government meeting, a student government committee meeting. And he had one last week as well. I think it's just for these 2 weeks. And that brings us, though, to Anytus, the student government representative of this dialogue. There's a big irony in this dialogue. Meno is a friend of the sophists. He is a sophist. But he is also a family friend of Anytus. And Anytus will unite. Ironically, Anytus says that he says, this is for the Southerners here, he says that he is going to save us. No, Anytus, ironically by the apology, Anytus will be on the side of the sophists, putting Socrates to death. But in this dialogue, Anytus doesn't even realize that Meno is a sophist, or that he's a student of the sophists. And Meno is the guest friend of Anytus. The guest friend is when you're from a different city in the Greek world. Every family in Thessaly had like a sister family in Athens. You know, we have sister cities in different countries. South Bend is the sister city of Czestochowa in Poland. Yeah.
Is it really?
Oh yeah, it is.
Wow.
Well, that worked in the Greek world for families. What that means, if you have a guest friend, if you're from Thessaly, if I'm from South Bend, and you live in Chicago, and you're my guest friend, when I come to Chicago, you got to put me up. And then when you come to South Bend, I got to put you up. And it's just assumed you don't act, you just do it for no money. You just do it. Well, Meno was the guest friend of Anytus in Athens, and so they're buddies. And Anytus hates the sophists, but he doesn't realize that Meno is a disciple of the sophists. So ironically, it's kind of like the way alumni sometimes treat professors and radical students. Like, this is a simple example, but I belong to a political group in my neighborhood called the Northeast Neighborhood Association. And last year, there was this senior at Notre Dame who was one of these, he was a complete and utter sophist who was going for the Rhodes Scholarship. And so he realized to get the Rhodes Scholarship, he had to, and I probably shouldn't, I don't mean to offend anybody by what I say, And I really do believe that we should put an end to war in northern Uganda. But this guy... Huh? No, he didn't get it. Thanks. Thanks be to God. No, but this guy was a complete revolutionary. He hated and seethed at the very people who were... He was also the student representative to the Northeast Neighborhood Association. And he would come... He seethed and hated all these old people in the Northeast Neighborhood Association. But these people loved this guy. Like, there was this one old guy in the Northeast Neighborhood Association who was just like a kind of a typical guy that doesn't really know much, and is very unsophisticated in the way he thinks, but he just saw a Notre Dame student who was interested, and he wanted to promote this guy, right? Not even realizing that if this guy had his ways, eventually, he would devour this old man and his family, right? And that he had nothing but contempt. Like the Northeast Neighborhood Association would talk about, we got to stop the student housing in the Northeast neighborhood. Well, this guy's the student representative, and he has like 6 students living in his house. So he would very quietly not say anything whenever they spoke about that issue. You know, he was the perfect sophist. And then in one meeting, he organized the Ooglu March. He was organizing the Ooglu March. In other words, if you want to win the Rhodes Scholarship, one of the things you got to do is you got to get together some sort of political movement that will save something in the world. So he identified that there was one of the conflicts in the world that we all needed to put an end to is the conflict in northern Uganda. And so he organized this, the typical thing. You organize a march, you get all these people to do in the march, you get press releases for the day, you have banners in the front of the march, you have people take pictures, you go to the UN, you lobby the UN to put an end, send troops to the Ooglu March, so you can send them to Uganda to, and it was the march in support of the Ugandan Liberation Army, because the Ugandan Liberation Army was freeing northern Uganda from something, and I don't know all the details, and I don't mean to kind of make fun of it, because I'm sure that there's something in northern Uganda that's bad. But this guy, his real concern was the Rhodes Scholarship. And he realized that to get a Rhodes Scholarship, he had to identify some conflict in the world that he was going to solve. And he was going to solve the conflict by the Ooglu March. But the guy was like a complete Marxist. I mean, he didn't believe in justice or truth. He just believed in promoting his agenda. He hated the family. He wrote articles in the Observer that expressed his hatred for the family, and how basically, like at one meeting one time, he was telling me how he would like to see the family destroyed. That's what he learned in his sociology classes. So these guys who are all old family members, who are grandfathers, they're helping this guy, promoting him, so that through the Ooglu March he gets the Rhodes Scholarship, so he can become a powerful politician one day and destroy the families of their grandchildren. Well, that's in other words, that's Anytus and Meno, right? That's the friendship between Anytus and Meno. It's that kind of thing.
Falling into it yourself.
Right. Then Socrates, at 94 and 95, he raises the same problem of the Laches. And he mentions Lysimachus as one of the guys that's a problem. How could you have all these public figures in Athens who were supposedly so virtuous, but they weren't able to teach the virtue to their children? And again, I think the answer to this puzzle is that virtue is a kind of knowledge, but it's a kind of moral knowledge, which means they weren't able to pass on the good habits. They thought that by teaching their children horseback riding, and fighting in armor and how to use a sword, that they were somehow passing on the virtues. But that's not passing on the virtues. That's passing on skills. And skills are not bad, but they're not the virtues. The danger with people like Meno is that when they can't prove that there is virtue, that they'll slide into skepticism. People like Meno will say because I can't see that there's virtue, I'm going to become a skeptic. And the political danger of that is that when they become skeptics, they become power mongers. The other danger of not being able to show intellectually what virtue is that Joe Sixpack has true opinions. This is the end of the dialogue, right? The distinction between true opinion and knowledge. What Socrates wants to argue in the end is that true opinion is good. So Socrates does not want to question the values of society. Almost every student that writes a paper on Socrates that I read anyway this semester, not last semester or any of the semesters before, but this semester, most of the students that write...
I think that's like exactly what I wrote about. I'm pretty sure.
I don't remember, so I don't know. But most students say Socrates challenged the values of society. That's not exactly true. Because he at the end of this dialogue, he says he's befriending true opinion. Right? True opinion is custom. It's the values of Joe and Jane Sixpack. It's the values of the guy that goes and works as a carpenter for 40 years. The guy that does that, he does acquire a kind of experience and wisdom about life. Any old man, inasmuch as he has not become corrupt, and inasmuch as he has done his job well in his life, he will have a kind of knowledge about good and bad, about virtue and vice. A family came to visit me, my stepbrother's wife's family came to visit me this weekend. Right, so my stepbrother, that's my brother from my mom's second marriage, but he was from my stepfather's first marriage. So he's a stepbrother, not half-brother. He got married, so his wife and her family came to visit me over the weekend. And the dad's a guy that never had a college education. And that...
Who is that?
That's E. Michael Jones.
Do you remember the...
Oh my god, I hated him.
I know, you did.
Oh my god, that's who it was. I almost walked out. I think I did. I left early.
You didn't walk out. You didn't.
Oh my god, I hate him.
You zoned out, but you didn't walk out.
Oh, I hate him.
He's
Basically said Jews were like... No fucking.
Anyway, let's go on to Plato. Let's go back to Plato.
He's a little bit opinionated.
So this guy, over dinner time, my stepsister-in-law and her father were talking about when she was younger, and how he basically came to the conclusion one day that he was going to screen all of her phone calls. And basically, if a guy answered the phone and said, "Hey, can I talk to Raina?" He would say, "No, you cannot talk to Raina." When you learn how to talk on the phone in a polite way and introduce yourself, and then ask for Raina in a polite way, I will let you talk to Raina. But until then, I will not pass the phone on. Click. Now, the guy's a simple guy. There's no college education there. And he just came to this knowledge based on his own. And as I was sitting there thinking about it, I thought that, I think my stepbrother Tommy is a somewhat upright guy. And I think that that's one of the reasons why she married Tommy. Because the father, in treating her boyfriends this way, he kind of instilled in her a standard of at least finding a boyfriend who's polite. And this is unspoken. There's no philosophical defense of what's going on here, but it's just what happens.
Experiential.
Because by the way the father basically sets the standards for the daughters will look for a boyfriend and eventually a husband. It's like the father instills in them a standard somehow. And I think that, and she still should give her dad a hard time about it. But, it's not like these want to, because it's embarrassing and all this kind of stuff. But nonetheless, the standard was set. But there's not a philosophical defense of what's going on. And he couldn't, when the whole family was making fun of the guy, he couldn't. There's no way he could defend himself. He didn't know how to defend himself. And
Well, you could have just said it worked, didn't it?
well, I mean, that was eventually kind of right towards. There were several things like this. This was not the only thing. But this happens in families all the time, right? I mean, basically, they went through the foibles of the dad, and it's basically there were points where the dad said, "This is where I draw the line." I mean, that's what basically in life, the wife and the daughters run 90% of the family. And the authority of the dad...
My dad was in town this weekend, and he probably didn't get in one word the whole time he was here.
Right.
We'd be like, just shut up. You don't know what you're talking about.
Exactly. No, exactly. No.
Not in a mean way, I promise.
The wife and the daughters... I mean this.
Sure.
I mean this.
I swear.
I mean this as an observation about reality, and I could get in trouble if this is repeated in the wrong circles. Because I have gotten in trouble because it's been repeated in the wrong circles. But really, the wife and the daughters run 90% of the family. What is the authority of the father in the family? It's the authority to pick 3 or 4 things in which he says, "This is where I draw the line."
Not making fun of me.
No. That becomes, and he can set some standards, but it's really only some. It's only a few standards that he can set. And that's what a dad does in a family. It's not that he's useless, or actually his role is very important, because well, in some sense, by setting the standards, he's setting the standard of virtue. And so a good father thinks through, okay, on what things am I going to draw the line? On what things am I willing to take shit from everybody else, but I'm not going to budge? No, I mean, but that's what it is. There are some things I'm going to take shit from everybody else in the family, but on these things I will not budge. And the thing is, what I think what bad fathers do is they say the thing I'm not going to budge on is I'm going to go out every night from 5 to 7 and get drunk, right? On that thing I will not budge. Well, he's just lost. He has 6 things he can choose in his life. He's just lost one. So a good,
more than one because he's also lost.
like for example, yeah. But I think a good father, I think a great example is a father that says to his boss, "I am going home at 5 o'clock, and on this thing I will not budge. Right? I'm going to do the work that I need to do so I can go home to my family at the right time." In other words, he chooses what he's basically. I'm not going to bend on this thing. I will work. In other words, and I know fathers that have done this. They have shown on their productivity charts how they do more work by 5 o'clock than everybody else does by 7 o'clock, because they don't take coffee breaks, they don't BS at the copy machine, they don't have Nerf basketball in their office. And basically, their boss will come to them and will say, "Well, you got to stay till 7. Well, why? Because everyone else is staying to 7. If you don't stay to 7, you make them look bad. Well, no, we got the productivity chart. I do my work. I'm going home at 5. What if you lose your job? I don't care. Well, and then they look at the productivity chart and they realize I can't fire the guys, because if I fire them, I can get sued. So I think that's what fathers of a family do, right? They choose the important battles for the sake of their family, and also for the moral sake of their family, trying to set moral standards. What a philosopher can do, a philosopher in some sense does challenge the values of society, right? Because I think Socrates would say, could I have a white wine? Pinot Grigio. Yes, please. Coffee or no?
It's okay. I have to leave it actually a little early.
Yeah, it's kind of busy this week, bro. Go.
Crawl under the table like my little sister.
So what philosophers do is philosophers challenge the sophists,
Probably good.
who are the ones that are setting the values in the city. But the values that they set are the values of money-making, pleasure-seeking, money, comfort, and pleasure, and power. And so it is true that Socrates is challenging those values, but he's befriending right opinion. And he's trying to discover because right opinion is right. It's true. There's something true about it, but it lacks a defense. So he is trying to find the defense for right opinion. And Socrates realizes that the only way that justice can come about in the city is when virtue and statesmanship coincide. But he's not sure how to make virtue and statesmanship coincide, because they're two different things. It's one thing to learn how to acquire power in a city and how to organize the city to keep it stable. It's another thing to be a virtuous man while doing that. And that's not a question he answers in this dialogue. Next, we move on to the Euthyphro. Are there any more questions about the Meno?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
Like, in the part where he talks about, like, Pericles and the other...
Yeah. Right.
I was just wondering, because in the Gorgias, he essentially proves how those men are not virtuous and that they left the city in a worse position than when they started out. And so I was wondering why, like, he brings them up again and talks to them as if he's saying that they are, like, good men. And I was just, it seemed then when he says at the end of the dialogue that the men of the city have true opinion, that's what they rule by.
Right.
I didn't know if he was... I don't know if it was like foreshadowing for like proving that the men of the city, like the reason why they can't teach virtue is because they only rule by true opinion.
I think it's different. I think you're on the right track, but it's a little different. I think you're right. Let me put it this way. I think you're right, but I would add something to what you said. That's how I'll put it. And that whenever, even in this dialogue, when he praises Pericles, it's ironic. And then I think he's saying, it's almost like he's saying, Meno, according to your standards of virtue, Pericles and Themistocles were good men. Why? Because they made Athens powerful. They're good men because Athens became an empire under them. They never lost battles. They made money. They helped the city make money. They made life more comfortable for everybody else. So, and I think a lot of men who buy into right opinion, they're willing to say, even if they have reservations about Pericles or Themistocles, or even if they're not quite sure that the money-making way is the best way of life, because the man with right opinion, he's not set on money-making. And he might not want to go off on all these wars, but he's not smart enough to argue anything different, so he's going to say, yeah, Pericles was a great man, of course, sure, why not? What else can he say? I think, so in other words, the sophists and a lot of people recognize Pericles and Themistocles as great men because they brought wealth, power, and pleasure to the city. There's going to be a lot of men with right opinion, men like Lysimachus, who may even give into that way of life, but on some level they realize this is not the right way to live. So even right opinion can question that way of life, but it can't give a reasoned response to it. Now, the Euthyphro. My argument here for this dialogue is that Euthyphro is the model of a revolutionary. Euthyphro is the model of a revolutionary. Euthyphro also is a materialist. The difference between Euthyphro and the sophist, though, is that Euthyphro, the sophists do not believe in the gods, and they are materialists. Euthyphro believes in the gods, but his belief in the gods is materialistic. He cannot come to the idea of justice. Again, because his belief in the gods is a materialistic belief in the gods. So in the first half of this dialogue, Socrates is trying, from 2a to 9c, Socrates is trying to start from experience to get Euthyphro to come to the idea of what justice is, or piety. Piety. The second half of the dialogue, from 9c to the end, Socrates is starting from the whole, from what the virtue of justice is, and he's trying to get Euthyphro to deduce what piety is as a part of justice. Euthyphro can never succeed in understanding what justice is, or, ironically, as a religious man, he cannot understand what piety is. Why? Again, it's because he cannot understand form or ideas. He's a self-righteous, materialistic, religious Puritan. And the city, like Euthyphro, is bogged down in music and Homer, the religion of Homer, and materialism. And because of this, it cannot see the form or virtue or peace. Or it cannot really see God as an invisible, immaterial, unitary thing. Because Euthyphro has a materialistic view of religion, he focuses not on what God is and what is the moral life that comes from the knowing God. He focuses on law, legalism. Whenever religion loses following Christ, for example, whenever Catholicism loses out on following Christ, using the sacraments to learn the way, and learning the Ten Commandments, to learn the way of life that leads us to Christ, that ultimately leads us to dwell with the Trinity, Catholicism will degrade into legalism. Because it will become materialistic.
Is that what the Inquisition is?
No. No, that's what modern Catholicism in the United States is. It's legalism. Because legalists are not... We tend to think that a legalist, the way we've been formed to think is that a legalist is the guy in authority that applies the law to crack down on all the poor souls that want to deviate from Catholic doctrine. Right? That's our conception of a legalist. But I think a real legalist is the person that wants to deviate from doctrine. Because they use law to defend themselves in their deviation. It's what Plato says in the Republic. If you have a market in which there are unjust men, there is no law that you can pass that will regulate their behavior.
Because they will keep getting around it.
Right. In other words, they will be legalists. They will know the law very well so they can escape from the law, to find the loopholes in it. They will know the law to argue, well, you didn't follow the right procedures, or, you came down on me, but you should have gone to this other thing first, and this person, like one time I remember, there's this parish in Detroit that was taking down the crucifixes in the school of the parish. So they wrote me a letter, and they said, you as a political philosopher, can you say anything about this? And so I wrote them a letter back, and I said, this is a small-time thing, it's not a big deal, but I said, well, yeah, I can say two things about it. One is that the church should not make the state dictate how the church lives. Two, this is the same thing that goes on in Islamic countries. In Islamic countries, the state forces the Catholic schools to take the crucifixes off the walls. And actually the state prohibits the schools from teaching catechism to its own students in Islamic countries. So I said, essentially, if that's what you're going to do in Catholic schools, then your government, or you're turning the parish into the same thing as a parish in an Islamic country. So I was denounced by the pastor, and the pastor is now a bishop. but I was denounced by the pastor to some committee in the Diocese of Detroit, and also he denounced me to people in the University of Notre Dame and the administration here. And one of his arguments, though, was this person has no right in intervening in an affair that is a local affair that is outside his area of jurisdiction. As if I have jurisdiction anywhere, right? But in other words, his point was to proceed. In other words, his point was they were clearly doing something that was probably imprudent, or I think maybe unjust. But they were not addressing that question. They were addressing the question of whether I even had a right to write a letter to give my opinion as a political scientist on what was going on here. In other words, I was not being legalistic. He was being legalistic. I was saying a Christian way of life, put crucifix in the classroom. He was using law to limit that practice. Ironically, also, Euthyphro, in the beginning of the dialogue, he presents himself as being like Socrates. He says, Socrates, I'm being persecuted and so are you. But in the end, Euthyphro doesn't care about the justice of Socrates or not. Ironically, many revolutionaries throughout history were actually religious people. And another feature of Euthyphro's life that's interesting as far as revolutionary movements is that Euthyphro was willing to kill his father. Almost all revolutionary movements, starting with John Locke, the Hussite Rebellion in Czech Republic, the French revolutionaries, Cromwell in England,
Hitler.
Yeah, they're all willing to kill their fathers, and oftentimes they understand the king as the father. They are also disproportionate in the way they... I met a German revolutionary 2 years ago. Who he became a violent revolutionary in 1968. And he said that the two things that they convinced him to do to get him to become a violent revolutionary, there was two things. It was fascinating. He said they convinced him to commit acts of self-abuse, and they convinced him to hate his father. And then he became a violent revolutionary. St. Peter, and these people I don't think knew St. Peter's epistle, but St. Peter in his second epistle, he says, beware of those men that will lead you away from the true faith. They will do so by appealing to lust, self-abuse, and rebellion from authority, hatred of your father. The father is the symbol of authority, both in the family and in public life. And so all revolutionary movements will teach or preach some sort of hatred of the father. And so ironically, Euthyphro, who's a religious man, he's willing to commit an act of impiety against his father. And piety involves respect for your father, legitimate authority, and God, right? And religious authority. It involves respect for all of these things. And I think that just sets up the problem for the dialogue, the Euthyphro. I think that's all we need to know about it. And unless there's any more questions.